April 7th, 1945, 0830 hours, 18,000 feet above Tokyo Bay. Flight Sergeant Tota Nimizu banked his Nakajima Ki 84 Frank fighter into the morning sun. Below him, the coastline of Honshu stretched like a gray ribbon against the Pacific. His squadron commander's voice crackled through the headset. 120 B-29 superfortresses inbound from the Marianas, right on schedule. Nimizu smiled beneath his oxygen mask. The Americans were predictable. Same altitude, same formation, same approach vector they'd used for months. And once again, no escort. Because everyone, from Tokyo High Command to the greenest recruit at Narimasu Airfield, knew the truth. American fighters couldn't reach Japan. Not possible, not practical, not happening. It was 1,500 miles from the Marianas to Tokyo. Even the vaunted P-51 Mustang with its legendary range couldn't make that journey and return. The math was simple, brutal, final. 750 miles one way, 750 back, over open ocean, with combat fuel burn, with headwinds, with the chaos of dogfighting eating through reserves. No fighter on Earth could do it. Nimizu had trained at Kasumigara Air Base with some of the finest aeronautical engineers in the empire. They'd shown him the calculations. A fighter carrying enough fuel for 1,500 miles would be so heavy, so sluggish, it couldn't climb, couldn't turn, couldn't fight. It would be a flying coffin. The Americans understood this too. That's why they'd never tried. 7. Viwi. Tu-29s had gone down to Japanese fighters in the last 2 weeks. Nimizu himself had put .50 caliber holes through a superfortress tail section on March 29th. The bomber had staggered toward the ocean, trailing smoke like a dying dragon. His squadron of Franks accelerated toward the bomber stream. Temperature at altitude, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The canopy frost scraped away under his gloved hand as he scanned the empty sky. Just the bombers today, like always. What Nimizu didn't know, what no one in Japanese Air Defense Command knew, was that 660 miles to the south, at that exact moment, 108 P-51 Mustang fighters were climbing through 15,000 feet. They'd been airborne from Iwo Jima for 2 hours. And they were coming. 2 hours earlier, Iwo Jima, Airfield Number 1, 0630 hours. Major James Tapp's hands were steady as he climbed into the cockpit of his P-51D, Margaret IV. 27 years old, 5'9", 160 pounds of pilot wrapped in leather, wool, and determination. The volcanic ash was already working its way into everything: eyes, nose, the joints of his flight suit. The island smelled like sulfur and diesel, like hell with a runway. Iwo Jima had been secured for exactly 3 weeks. Secured. That was the official word. But Tapp had watched ground crews dig 333 Japanese bodies out of the fighter bivouac area just 10 days ago. Soldiers who'd emerged from caves in a final banzai charge. 44 Americans died that night. The caves were still there, still occupied. Security was relative. The P-51 rocked slightly as the crew chief secured the external tanks. 2 massive 110-gallon paper composite drop tanks slung under the wings like torpedoes. They looked absurd, fragile, like something a child would make in art class. Paper tanks. The engineers had gotten creative. Metal was scarce. Aluminum was precious. So they'd pressed layers of impregnated paper pulp into molds, creating disposable fuel bladders that weighed 40 pounds empty instead of 110. They held pressure. They didn't leak much. And most importantly, when you jettisoned them over enemy territory, you weren't handing the Japanese scrap metal to turn into bullets. Each tank held 110 gallons of 130-octane aviation fuel. Combined with the P-51's internal capacity, 269 gallons in the fuselage, 85 gallons in each wing, Tapp was sitting on 489 gallons of explosive liquid. Enough range for 1,650 miles. Theoretically. "Fuel's topped, sir," the crew chief shouted over the idling Packard-Merlin VA-16507 engine. All 12 cylinders running clean. Oil pressure nominal. Coolant system holding. Tapp nodded. The Merlin was a British heart in an American body. 1,490 horsepower at sea level. Supercharged to maintain power up to 28,000 feet. It breathed with a distinct sound, a howl that separated Mustangs from every other fighter in the sky. But it was thirsty. 7.5 hours of flying time lay ahead. 750 miles to Tokyo. However long the fight lasted. 750 miles back. If the engine ran perfectly, if the fuel consumption calculations were accurate, if the weather cooperated, if combat didn't force him to push the throttle forward and watch his range evaporate. If. Lieutenant E.L. Bright climbed into his Mustang 2 spaces down the flight line. 23 years old, fresh face, nervous hands. This was his first VLR, very long-range, mission. First time seeing Japan. First time facing the reality that there would be no land, no divert field, no second chances for the next 8 hours. "You afraid?" Bright asked Tapp during the pre-mission brief. "Terrified," Tapp had said, "but that's the fuel gauge talking." Because that was the thing about VLR missions that nobody talked about in training. The psychological weight of watching your fuel needle drop over open ocean. Every degree of temperature change affected consumption. Every adjustment of mixture affected range. Every combat maneuver burned fuel you might need 400 miles later. And if you got it wrong? The Pacific didn't care about your calculations. The ground crews had worked through the night, preparing the fighters. Volcanic ash clogged carburetors every 6 missions. Humidity corroded electrical systems. Underground sulfur steam created soft spots in the runway that could collapse a landing gear. Spark plugs fouled from lead deposits after flying extended periods at low power settings. Technical Sergeant Charles Barr had built a rotating flight simulator out of salvaged P-51 parts and a Japanese motor, complete with paper drop tanks, to train pilots on the Uncle Dog VHF homing system that would guide them home. Because most of the 506th Fighter Group pilots had never heard of Uncle Dog before arriving on Iwo. The navigation system was that new, that experimental, that crucial. At 0645 hours, Colonel Kenneth Powell's voice came through every cockpit radio. "All groups, this is lead. Weather update from the Advance B-29. Frontal system 200 miles north of Iwo. Cloud tops at 11,000 feet. Embedded thunderstorms. We're going through it." No one responded. There was nothing to say. At 0650, the first P-51 roared down Airfield No. 1's crushed coral runway. Then another. Then another. 108 Mustangs in total. Every serviceable fighter from the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups. They formed up over Mount Suribachi, that volcanic crater where Marines had planted a flag 43 days ago. The brother agate VHF beacon on the summit transmitted its continuous tone, UD, the audio signal that would guide them home. If they made it that far. By 0710, the formation was northbound at 8,000 feet, climbing. Ahead lay 40 miles of empty ocean to Katajima, where a B-29 Navigator aircraft waited with specialized homing equipment to lead them north. Behind them, Iwo Jima shrank to a gray smudge against endless blue. Captain Robert W. Moore checked his fuel flow. Mixture rich, RPM 2,300, manifold pressure 35 inches, fuel consumption 60 gallons per hour. He did the math in his head. 8 hours of fuel, 7.5 hours of flying, 30 minutes of margin, 30 minutes between landing and swimming. The Japanese made 3 critical assumptions in early 1945. First, American fighters lacked the range to escort B-29s from any available base. Second, even if fighters somehow reached Japan, the fuel burden would make them easy prey for Japanese interceptors. Third, paper drop tanks, if the Americans were foolish enough to use such flimsy devices, would rupture from fuel pressure or combat maneuvers. All 3 assumptions were logical, well-reasoned, based on sound aeronautical engineering. All 3 were catastrophically wrong. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was an accident of Anglo-American collaboration that had produced something unprecedented. The airframe was pure North American aviation, designed in 1940 with a laminar flow wing so aerodynamically clean it generated 30% less drag than conventional wings. Originally powered by the Allison Phi 1710 engine, the Mustang had been merely adequate. Then, in October 1942, British test pilot Ronald Harker climbed into a Mustang at Duxford Aerodrome and realized the airframe was wasted on the Allison. He suggested mounting the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine instead. The combination was incendiary. Since the Packard-built Merlin 68, designated V1650-7 in American service, featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that force-fed air into 12 cylinders at high altitude. At 25,000 feet, where the Allison wheezed, the Merlin produced 1,490 horsepower. Maximum speed, 437 miles per hour in level flight. Dive speed, 490 miles per hour before compressibility effects set in. Service ceiling, 41,900 feet. But speed was secondary to something else, something the Japanese hadn't accounted for. Efficiency. The P-51's laminar flow wing and low-drag airframe consumed fuel at 0.5 gallons per mile at optimal cruise settings. The P-47 Thunderbolt, by comparison, burned 0.9 gallons per mile. The P-38 Lightning, 1.2 gallons per mile. This gave the Mustang a combat radius, the distance it could fly, fight, and return, of 950 miles on internal fuel alone. Add the paper drop tanks, 1,650 miles, total range. But there was a catch that the pilots learned fast. Those 110-gallon paper tanks weren't just fuel storage, they were commitment devices. Once filled, they added 660 pounds to the aircraft's weight. The P-51's center of gravity shifted aft. Handling characteristics changed. The aircraft became tail-heavy, sluggish in roll, vulnerable in a dogfight. And you couldn't just drop them whenever you wanted. Fuel management was surgical. The drop tanks had to be emptied first, before any combat, to restore the Mustang's agility. Internal fuselage tanks came next. Wing tanks last, because they were positioned near the center of gravity. Get the sequence wrong and your aircraft would become unflyable. Run internal tanks too low during combat, and you die 400 miles from Iwo Jima with external fuel you couldn't transfer. The 110-gallon paper tanks had arrived at 8th Air Force bases in England in March 1944. Luftwaffe Technical staff who examined captured examples couldn't believe it. Paper? Pressed pulp? Holding fuel at 12,000 feet where temperatures dropped to minus 30 Fahrenheit? Impossible! But the chemistry was elegant. The paper was impregnated with phenolic resin, the same compound used in electrical insulators, layer upon layer pressed into cylindrical molds, sealed with additional resin, fitted with metal fuel lines and pressure valves. They worked. Weight, 40 pounds empty versus 110 pounds for aluminum. Cost, $15 versus $100 for metal. Disposable. Once jettisoned, they sank or disintegrated. No salvage value for the enemy. The first fighters to use paper tanks over Germany in March 1944 reported no structural failures, no leaks, no ruptures, just 220 gallons of extra range that let P-51s escort bombers to Berlin and beyond. By April 1945, the Pacific Theater had received enough paper tanks to equip every P-51 heading to Iwo Jima. And the Japanese had no idea they existed. Because when you're defending your home islands, you calculate threats based on known enemy capabilities. You track American aircraft production. You study captured equipment. You intercept radio traffic. But you don't expect disposable paper fuel tanks to change the strategic balance of air power in the Pacific. Intelligence briefings at Narimasu Airfield outside Tokyo showed that the closest American fighter base was Saipan, 1,500 miles south. Even with drop tanks, no American fighter could make that round trip. The seizure of Iwo Jima on February 19th didn't change the math. Iwo was still 750 miles from Tokyo. Still too far. The Japanese had run the calculations themselves. A fighter carrying that much fuel would be helpless in combat. What they didn't calculate was what happened when you built the most aerodynamically efficient fighter of the war, equipped it with the most advanced engine, fueled it with disposable tanks, and trained pilots to manage every ounce of fuel with mathematical precision. On April 7, 1945, the 108 P-51s climbing away from Iwo Jima were carrying 269 gallons internal fuselage fuel, 85 gallons each wing tank, 170 total, 110 gallons each paper drop tank, 220 total, 659 gallons. At cruise settings, 2,200 RPM, 32 inches manifold pressure, lean mixture. Fuel burn was 48 gallons per hour. Range, 13.7 hours theoretical, 8 hours practical with combat reserve. Tokyo was 3 hours and 40 minutes away. The fighters climbed through the frontal system at 0800 hours. Inside the clouds, turbulence hammered the formation. Ice crystals formed on windscreens. Visibility dropped to 0. Radio calls filled with static. 2 fighters collided in the clouds. Both pilots lost. But 106 emerged on the north side at 15,000 feet, still climbing. At 0825 hours, 40 miles off the coast of Honshu, the formation linked up with the B-29 bomber stream. 107 superfortresses in tight formation. Aluminum monsters each carrying 20,000 pounds of incendiary bombs. The target, Nakajima Aircraft Engine Plant in western Tokyo. The factory that built engines for Ki-84 Franks, Ki-43 Oscars, and every other fighter trying to stop them. Major Tapp switched his fuel selector to the paper drop tanks. The engine coughed once, then smoothed out as fuel flowed from the external tanks. The Mustangs would burn those tanks dry before reaching Tokyo, shedding 660 pounds and transforming from heavy pigs into razor-sharp killers. At 0835, the radar stations at Choshi picked up the incoming formation. Air Defense Command scrambled 125 fighters from 7 airfields around Tokyo. Ki-84 Franks, A-6M-0s, Ki-43 Oscars. Pilots like Flight Sergeant Nimizu, who'd trained for years, who knew their aircraft, who understood the sky above their homeland. They expected B-29s. They got something else. 0845 hours, 18,000 feet above Tokyo Bay. Nimizu was 6,000 yards from the lead B-29 when his wingman's voice cut through the radio. "Mustangs! High and behind us!" Impossible. Nimizu craned his neck, scanning the sky through the armored glass canopy. There, silver glints at 25,000 feet, sun at their backs, diving toward the bomber stream. American fighters. Dozens of them. His brain stuttered trying to process it. P-51. S over Tokyo, with altitude advantage, with speed, diving through the Japanese formation like hawks through pigeons. The Mustangs had jettisoned their paper drop tanks 50 miles offshore. Now they were coming in at 380 miles per hour, 2,700 RPM, manifold pressure at 46 inches, the Merlin engines screaming at combat power. The Ki-84. Frank was an excellent aircraft, perhaps the best fighter Japan produced in 1945. Maximum speed, 392 miles per hour. Excellent maneuverability. Heavy armament with two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns. In a one-on-one dogfight at medium altitude, a skilled pilot in a Frank could match a Mustang. But that's not what happened. The P-51s hit the Japanese formation in coordinated pairs. Welded wing tactics developed over Germany. One Mustang would engage, forcing the enemy into a defensive turn. The second Mustang would cut across the turn radius, getting a deflection shot. Lieutenant Bright saw his first zero at 0847. The A-6M was climbing toward the bomber stream. Alone, no wingman. Bright pushed the nose down, added power, felt the Mustang accelerate in the dive. The Zero pilot never saw him coming. 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, converged at 300 yards. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute. Total firepower, 4,800 rounds per minute. Bright opened fire at 400 yards. Tracers walked across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter staggered, trailing white smoke, coolant from the punctured radiator. It rolled inverted and went into a spin. 45 seconds later, Bright had 2 more kills. 2 Ki-43 Oscars that tried to attack a straggling B-29. "Just sitting ducks," he'd say later in the debriefing. "You just drove up behind them and pulled the trigger." But it wasn't that simple. The Japanese pilots were fighting hard. They were brave. They were skilled. They were just completely unprepared for what was happening. Japanese tactical doctrine in 1945 relied on single aircraft, attacking bomber formations, diving through, firing, then breaking away before the bombers' defensive guns could track them. It was effective against unescorted bombers. Deadly, even. Against escorted bombers? Suicide. When Nimizu dove toward the lead B-29, breaking through at 380 miles per hour, 2 Mustangs peeled off to intercept him. He never got close enough to fire. The first Mustang came from his 4 o'clock, high. The second was waiting below. Nimizu broke right, pulling 5 Gs, the Frank's superb maneuverability keeping him just ahead of the gunfire. Then the second Mustang lit him up. Cannon shells tore through his left wing. The Frank shuddered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen, red mist mixing with oil. The control stick went mushy. Aileron cables severed. Nimizu punched out 12,000 feet. His parachute opened 800 feet above Tokyo Bay. He watched his fighter spiral into the water, trailing black smoke. From his parachute, Nimizu counted 18 Japanese aircraft falling from the sky. Some trailing fire, some spinning, some simply gliding down with dead engines. He also saw something that would haunt him: a B-29 bomber, hit by Japanese gunfire, staggering through the formation with 2 engines out. It should have been an easy kill. But 6 Mustangs formed a protective circle around it, fending off every attacker until the superfortress limped toward the ocean. The battle lasted 45 minutes. Major James Tapp, the pilot who'd been terrified about fuel calculations that morning, scored 3 confirmed kills. He'd gotten his first at 0848, a Ki-61 Tony fighter that made the mistake of attacking head-on. Tapp held his fire until 200 yards, then walked. 50 caliber rounds through the Tony's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter exploded. Captain Robert Moore got 2 kills in 45 seconds. Both K-143 Oscars that tried to attack the same B-29 from opposite directions. Moore came in from above, hit the first Oscar, reversed his turn, and caught the second before it could react. The speed advantage was devastating. Where Zeros topped out at 350 miles per hour, the Mustangs could sustain 400 miles per hour in level flight. And if a Mustang needed to disengage, push the nose down, fireball the throttle, and dive away at 490 miles per hour, a speed no Japanese fighter could match. Compressibility, the aerodynamic shuddering that occurred as aircraft approached the speed of sound, affected most fighters at 450 miles per hour. The P-51's laminar flow wing delayed compressibility effects until nearly 500 miles per hour, giving it an escape route no enemy could follow. Sergeant Burdell Hanson, watching from the tail gunner position of a B-29, radioed, "Mustangs are knocking Japs down all over the sky. Japs parachuting down all around us. I'll never forget it." By 0930, the Japanese fighter force had withdrawn. Of the 125 that scrambled, 21 were confirmed destroyed, 5 probably destroyed, 7 damaged. The B-29s completed their bomb run unmolested. 20,000 pounds of incendiaries per bomber. 2,140,000 pounds total. The Nakajima engine plant disappeared in a firestorm. 0 B-29s were lost to enemy fighters. At 0945, the Mustangs assembled at the rally point, a predetermined location 50 miles off the coast where a B-29 Navigator aircraft waited, transmitting the Uncle Dog homing tone on VHF frequency. The fighters tuned their AN/ARA8 homing adapters, listening for the audio signal. Steady tone meant on course. U meant steer right. D meant steer left. The formation turned south. Major Tapp checked his fuel gauges. He'd burned through the paper drop tanks. Internal fuselage tank was at 180 gallons. Wing tanks full at 170 gallons combined. 350 gallons remaining. 750 miles to Iwo Jima. Still enough. Barely. The 2 Mustangs never made it to the rally point. Both had taken hits during combat. Not fatal damage, but enough to puncture fuel lines or crack tanks. Both pilots ditched within sight of the rally point submarine. Both were recovered. 3 more fighters ran out of fuel 150 miles from Iwo. All 3 pilots were picked up by destroyers stationed along the return route. The Air-Sea Rescue Network. 7 stations spaced along the route, each manned by submarines or destroyers, covered by B-29 Super Dumbo aircraft, and escorted by P-51 Josephines carrying deployable life rafts, saved 57 pilots during the 5-month VLR campaign. 103 Mustangs landed at Iwo Jima between 1700 and 1730 hours, some with less than 20 gallons remaining, some with battle damage. 1 crashed on landing due to hydraulics shot away. Pilot walked away with minor injuries. But they'd made it, all the way to Tokyo, all the way back. The impossible had become routine. The missions didn't stop. April 12th. Another escort to Tokyo. 15 Japanese fighters destroyed. 4 P-51s lost. April 16th. First independent fighter sweep. Weather turned the mission into chaos, but the message was sent. Mustangs could strike anywhere in Japan. April 19th. Kanoya Airfield, southern Kyushu. The first wave received a green light from the control tower. Clearance to land. Japanese ground crew thought they were friendly aircraft. Then the Mustangs opened fire. 32 Japanese fighters destroyed in aerial combat. 30 more destroyed on the ground. 70 damaged. The psychological impact was seismic. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had owned the skies above their homeland. Air raid sirens meant B-29s, predictable, high altitude, and dangerous but manageable. Fighters meant defending against known threats at known times. Now, American fighters could appear anywhere. Strike any airfield, attack any target, at any time. Japanese defensive doctrine collapsed. Throughout May, the tempo increased. 3 fighter groups, the 15th, 21st, and 506th, flying daily missions. Not just Tokyo now, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, airfields across Honshu. May 29th, Yokohama. 150 Japanese fighters scrambled. 58 were destroyed or damaged. They managed to down 5 B-29s, but 175 bombers returned with battle damage that would have been fatal without fighter escort. The kill ratio was devastating, 13-1 in favor of the Americans. But it was the missions that received no opposition that told the real story. June 23rd. Largest single-day tally of the campaign. 91 Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged. But pilots reported finding dummy aircraft on airfields, plywood and canvas mock-ups, decoys. Real aircraft were being moved, hidden in revetments under trees, sometimes 2 miles from airfields, drained of fuel so they wouldn't burn when strafed. Japan was hoarding its remaining air power for the final battle, the invasion of the homeland. Lieutenant Colonel James Tapp, now an ace with 5 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary, "They're not coming up anymore. We fly 750 miles to find nothing but empty airfields and decoys. It's like hunting ghosts." By July, Fighter Command had to expand beyond military targets. Locomotives, freight trains, shipping, radar towers, anything that supported the Japanese war machine. July 16th. The last major air battle. After that, Japanese fighters essentially disappeared from the sky. But the danger didn't disappear. Japanese defenders stretched 50-foot cables across airfields to snag low-flying attackers, planted landmines triggered by aircraft shadows, deployed barrage balloons and kites as obstacles, positioned every available weapon, rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft cannon, around remaining aircraft. One P-51 pilot described strafing Tokorozawa airfield. Tracers coming from everywhere. Ground, trees, buildings, like flying through a cage made of bullets. The mission tempo was relentless. Pilots flew 7-hour missions every 48 hours. Maintenance crews worked 18-hour shifts keeping Mustangs airborne despite volcanic ash destroying spark plugs, humidity corroding electrical systems, and underground sulfur steam weakening runway surfaces. On June 1st, weather extracted its toll. 148 P-51s launched for Osaka. En route, they hit an unforecasted thunderstorm embedded in the front. Severe turbulence, icing, zero visibility. 27 aircraft collided or lost control. 24 pilots died. It was the single worst loss of the Pacific Air War, and it happened without an enemy in sight. Colonel Kenneth Powell, commander of the 21st Fighter Group, wrote to his pilots afterward, "The Pacific itself is the enemy. The distance, the weather, the ocean that doesn't care about your fuel calculations." But they kept flying. April through August 1945, 51 VLR missions flown. 41 effective, weather scrubbed the rest. 4,172 effective sorties. Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged, 1,062. Surface vessels sunk or damaged, 254. Locomotives destroyed, 134. Railroad cars destroyed, 355. Buildings and hangars destroyed, 246. The cost? 114 P-51s lost in combat. 103 lost to accidents and weather. 91 pilots killed. Another 57 pilots were recovered from the ocean, plucked from life rafts by submarines, destroyers, and rescue aircraft. But perhaps the greatest contribution of Iwo Jima and the VLR campaign wasn't the fighters. It was what they enabled. From April through August, 2,400 B-29 Superfortresses made emergency landings at Iwo Jima. Bombers that couldn't reach the Marianas due to battle damage, fuel problems, or mechanical failure. 2,400 bombers, 11 crew members per bomber, 26,400 airmen who would have died in the Pacific without that tiny volcanic island 750 miles from Tokyo. The strategic calculus was brutal but simple. Iwo Jima cost 24,000 American casualties during the invasion, but it saved 26,400 airmen afterward. The island paid for itself in lives alone. Flight Sergeant Tota Nimizu was recovered from Tokyo Bay on April 7, 1945. He spent the next 4 months defending Japan from Mustangs he couldn't catch, couldn't outclimb, couldn't escape. His unit was transferred to Kyushu in July, then to a camouflaged airfield 40 miles north of Tokyo in August. On August 14th, the final day of combat operations, Nimizu was one of the last Japanese pilots to intercept American fighters. The mission was a 4-group strike: 148 P-51s and P-47N Thunderbolts. He never got close. After the war, Nimizu was interviewed by U.S. Army Air Force's intelligence officers. They asked him about the moment he first saw Mustangs over Tokyo. "We thought you couldn't reach Japan," Nimizu said through a translator. "Our commanders told us it was impossible. They showed us the calculations. American fighters didn't have the range." "Then what did you think when you saw them?" "I thought our commanders were wrong about many things." Major James Tapp flew 52 VLR missions from Iwo Jima. He finished the war with 5 confirmed kills, the first American pilot to become an ace over Japan. He never spoke publicly about the fear, the bone-deep terror of watching fuel needles drop over open ocean. of knowing that every combat maneuver burned reserves you might need 400 miles later. But in his personal papers, donated to the Smithsonian in 1989, there's a single entry dated April 7, 1945. "We flew to Tokyo today, 750 miles. They said it couldn't be done, but here's the secret nobody tells you. Impossible just means nobody's figured out how yet. We figured it out. Paper tanks, Merlin engines, aerodynamics, mathematics, and pilots who'd rather do the impossible than accept the alternative. We made the impossible routine. That's what wins wars." The P-51 Mustang, that hybrid accident of Anglo-American engineering, fought in every theater of World War II. It shot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter. It escorted bombers to Berlin. It strafed trains in France. It dominated the skies over Italy. But it was over the Pacific, during those 5 months from April to August 1945, that the Mustang achieved something unprecedented in aviation history. It routinely flew combat missions at ranges that, according to all pre-war doctrine, all mathematical models, all conventional wisdom, were categorically impossible. 1,500-mile round trips, over open ocean, with combat reserves, with pilots managing every ounce of fuel with surgical precision, with disposable paper tanks that cost $15 and changed the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The Japanese weren't wrong to dismiss the threat. They were just using yesterday's mathematics to calculate tomorrow's possibilities. And that's always been the mistake empires make when they're dying. They assume the rules that kept them safe yesterday will protect them tomorrow. The men of 7th Fighter Command, the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups rewrote those rules at 25,000 feet, one mission at a time, until the sky above Tokyo belonged to silver Mustangs with paper tanks and speeds that touched 490 miles per hour in the dive. When Flight Sergeant Nimizu saw those first Mustangs on April 7th, diving through the Japanese formation with the morning sun behind them, his brain couldn't process it because it violated everything he'd been taught about aeronautical engineering, strategic planning, and mathematical possibility. But there's a truth about war that no calculation can capture. Impossible is negotiable. And on April 7, 1945, at 08:45 hours, 18,000 feet above Tokyo Bay, the impossible became operational fact. The Japanese pilots scoffed at drop-tank Mustangs. Then they learned, in the worst possible way, that paper beats steel when the mathematics are right. The engineering is flawless, and the pilots are willing to bet their lives on 30 minutes of fuel margin. The speeds reached 490 miles per hour over Tokyo that day, and nothing in Japan could catch them.